Chapter 75, Transportation, Section 24. But Van Diemen's Land was the chief sphere of the probation system. The colonists, at first, were not indisposed towards the experiment. The promise of an unlimited expenditure and a boundless supply of labor reconciled them to its gigantic proportions. It assumed the air of philanthropy. Sir John Franklin, when he announced the first outline of the scheme, referred to the redemption of the Negro slave, and said that England was about to incur a large expenditure in the attempt to emancipate her erring children from the infinitely more degrading slavery of crime. This picture was fully borne out by Sir James Graham, who observed, in reference to the probationer, "New scenes will open to his view, where skilled labor is in great demand, where the earnings of industry rapidly accumulate. The prisoner should be made to know that he enters on a new career. The classification of the convicts in the colony of Van Diemen's Land, as set forth in Lord Stanley's dispatch, should be made intelligible to him. He should be told that he will be sent to Van Diemen's Land, there, if he behave well, at once to receive a ticket of leave, which is equivalent to freedom, with the certainty of abundant maintenance, the fruits of industry." In describing the probation system, it is not necessary to do more than state its general aspects and acknowledged results. The publications in the colonies and the official documents substantially concur, and with minute controversy, history has no concern. To view the subject with the prejudices of a party would be treason to those important interests affected by the question. Crime will still be committed, and its treatment, the great problem of the age, is the business of all men. The Comptroller General, Captain Forster, who obtained his appointment by the influence of Captain Montague, entered on his office when Sir Eardley Wilmot arrived 1843, and remodelled the practical measures of Dr. Milligan, who for a time, under the auspices of Sir John Franklin, had possessed the chief command. Captain Forster was too well acquainted with discipline to entertain the smallest expectation of ultimate success. Among his friends, he expressed his distrust without reserve, but believing the home government irrevocably pledged, he concluded that penal philosophy was not his affair, and, not without reason, that he was better qualified than a stranger to mitigate the natural tendencies of the system. He had not been consulted in its structure, he did not hold himself responsible for its errors or results. During 4 years, ending in 1844, more than 15,000 prisoners arrived. In 1847, there were, in all, 30,000. Free emigration was stopped. In 1842, 2,446 emigrants landed. In 1843, 26. In 1844, only 1. The greater number of transports under short sentences became almost immediately eligible for hire, who were at first preferred by the farmers to free men. The free labourers rapidly retreated to the other colonies. Gangs of probationers were formed throughout the country. Their locations were chiefly selected with reference rather to their easy accommodation than their useful employment. A few large gangs were established beyond the settled country, but the greater part were lodged in the old buildings erected for the use of road parties and ill-adapted for either moral or industrial operations. Van Diemen's Land was supposed by the Crown to be peculiarly fitted for the experiment. An area nearly equal to Ireland, occupied by little more than 50,000 inhabitants, appeared to offer ample room for the stations. It was not considered that the free population was condensed chiefly within a line of country between the Derwent and Tamar, or on the borders of those rivers, and that however a temporary location might be chosen, the settled districts must ultimately absorb the pass and ticket holders. Most were within a few hours, nearly all within a day's journey of the free population. The ample supply of food, a system of moral training which devoted considerable time to books and pencils, a decided discouragement of strictness in discipline and severity in punishment, removed the temptation to rebel. The chief grievance of the prisoners was the prohibition of smoking, often indeed evaded by the connivance and assistance of the overseers. Yet, while at some stations indolence and plenty prevailed, at others, remote from the public eye, misery and vice existed to an extent too awful for more than mere reference. At the coal mines, the men were robbed of their provisions by their fellow prisoners. New clothing was not issued until they were in tatters. Hundreds were without shirts, scores without shoes, and some only wrapped round with rugs. 1843. These evils were certainly not lasting, but they have been by no means infrequent at stations remote from the capital and from the notice of the press. The colony did not afford a sufficient corps of able and conscientious superintendents. Many were military and naval officers, qualified to control, but utterly unable to instruct. The quiet movement of the vast system was earnestly desired by the local government. Its effects would, of course, be inferred from the absence of punishments, and it was understood by the lower officers that the shorter their blacklists, the more agreeable their periodical reports. It was stated by the comptroller that they were engaged to carry out the system, not to condemn it, and disaffection ended in dismissal. The rapid increase of numbers disconcerted the comptroller. The new arrivals were sent to crowd the stations of their predecessors. Order and even decency were impracticable. The accommodation of the officers was often miserable, too distant for proper inspection. As the men removed from Norfolk Island were added to the gangs, their tendencies became more alarming and apparent. They were of the worst possible description and defied all remedy. No artifices of language will enable the moralist to describe them. The mean pay of the officers, their uncertain tenure of office, and the nature of their duties would only attract candidates for employment as a temporary expedient. The control of considerable bodies of men, under favorable circumstances, demands both vigilance and firmness. The prisoners perceive, almost at a glance, the character of their superiors. Their history and habits are the theme of constant inquiry and discussion. An equal temper and unwearied attention are required in this arduous occupation, but the persons engaged were often wholly disqualified by their past pursuits and personal character to inspire either awe or respect. The practical oversight was often committed to the least responsible. The religious instructors selected by the government, though chiefly of the Episcopal or Catholic professions, were of miscellaneous origin. The clergy of all persuasions were formally admitted to the road parties. Their discourses were welcome, for they gave an interval from toil. Some performed service on the Sabbath at their own charge. The new instructors were strictly official, some indeed highly educated men of long standing in their respective churches. Others were the offshoots of various sects, without education or personal dignity. Of their qualifications, several high officers have spoken with contempt. These opinions were, however, partly the indirect result of disputes, in which the instructors were very generally involved. Several were known to convey accounts of evils within the stockades, which it was the desire of the department both to conceal and to suppress. Notwithstanding, many were deficient in zeal and ability. Their labors were strictly formal and were soon considered hopeless. Several exceptions must be understood, but to select them would be invidious. The exclusive occupation of clergymen as teachers of convicts is generally unfavorable to their usefulness. The recognized pastor of a congregation brings to the prison the reputation and sanctity of his character among the free. The instructor of a gang is soon considered but as the agent of penal government. The basis of Lord Stanley's system was an imaginary demand for labor in Van Diemen's Land. The Home Government was so confident in this resource that placards were suspended on the English prisons, holding forth the prospect of high wages as the final stage of transportation. The execution of public works in the colonies, except at an equivalent price, was strictly prohibited. By improving the settled parts of the colony, the Crown might have increased its attraction to capitalists, and by diverting an excess of labourers, excited the competition of masters. The governor was desirous of allaying colonial irritation by some substantial boon. The orders of Lord Stanley were, however, rigid. The Comptroller General was forbidden to adopt any detailed regulation at variance with the scheme prescribed by the Crown, or to alter or depart from its provisions without express authority. The demands of the settlers for labourers soon fell far short of the supply. The written contracts for the pass-holders in the first stages of service bound the master to pay over a portion of their wages to the Crown. This course was troublesome. Thus few, except in the last stage of their service, were able to obtain employment at all, and the graduated scale of payment fell to the ground. The accumulation at the hiring depots, sometimes to the number of 4,000, who could obtain no engagement, induced the governor to urge their useful employment in public works. He stated that neither private individuals nor the colonial treasury could afford to employ them in improvements of prospective utility, and recommended that a fixed moderate payment should be accepted in return for the service they might perform. The reply of his lordship was decided. If, he observed, the free inhabitants cannot purchase the labour we have to sell at a price which it is worth our while to accept, it remains for us to consider whether other advantageous employment cannot be found. The necessaries of life may be produced to such an extent as to render the convicts independent of the free colonists, who are not entitled to claim any compensation for the inconvenience with which their presence may be attended. His lordship proposed that new lands should be surveyed, cultivated and sold for the advantage of the imperial treasury, and thus the government might assert its independence of the settlers and teach them to appreciate correctly the value of convict labour. The defiant tone of this dispatch and its contemptuous reference to the settlers determined the question of transportation. The partisans of abolition could assail the system at its foundation. Thenceforth, the interests of the colonists, moral and material, were obviously one. The Crown was to compete in the market with the farmer and the landowner, and the labour market to be overruled by official contrivance for the benefit of the imperial treasury. The colonial newspapers were filled with notices of robberies and the complaints of employers. A rapid emigration took place. Free labourers and mechanics sold their properties, acquired by years of toil, often for a trifling sum, and the immigrants, brought to the colony at great public and private cost, almost universally passed over to the adjacent communities. The Comptroller General attempted to carry out the supplementary plan ordered by Lord Stanley. Agricultural establishments were formed, but this only provided for the probationers. The pass holders were entitled to enter the service of the settlers. To detain them 20 miles from the nearest farmhouse was to extend indefinitely the first stage of punishment. But when drafted to the settled districts, they could not be employed, except for the benefit of the colony, and against this resource the decision of Lord Stanley was imperative. The hiring depots were placed in settled districts or chief towns. The stage of rigid discipline being passed, the convicts were not required to labour with diligence or suffer much restraint. They were now deemed fit for society, and it was merely the fault of their numbers that many were unemployed. They were permitted to roam about in search of casual employment, to spread themselves over the country. They were allowed to expend the money they acquired in temporary service, and while any remained, they were unwilling to accept an engagement. Thus, they were fed and clothed, and lightly worked. They were free from care, their time was running out, and they were objects rather of envy than commiseration. The official reports of the probation system forwarded to Downing Street were not unfavourable. Lord Stanley asserted in his place that from all he could judge, the system had been productive of the most beneficial results, and that the general conduct of the convicts had been most satisfactory. But in his dispatch to the governor, he complained that amidst an abundance of statistics, the notices of moral success were slight, unimportant, and few. The operation of the system was, however, well known to his lordship. The Under-Secretary, Sir J. Stephen, with extraordinary exactness, described the actual condition of the prisoner population, living, not by a healthy competition for employment, but by a habitual and listless dependence on the public purse. He depicted the apathy and indolence, the low tone of moral feeling, the lamentable and degrading habits which prevailed, and asserted that in the hands of Lord Stanley were proofs of an existing state of convict society, such as would be contemplated with deep solicitude. It may not be impossible to reconcile in detail these official and parliamentary declarations, but taken alone, they would lessen our confidence in the value of ministerial explanations, not less than in official reports. The Comptroller General stated that the system would not only prove beneficial to Great Britain, but work a great moral reformation in the convict population, that it had fully answered its object. These assertions were confirmed by the governor, who remarked that the men behaved as well as possible. Such views were strongly opposed by other testimony. Among the most conspicuous was that of Dr. Hampton, surgeon superintendent of the Sir George Seymour, who, charged with the care of a party from Pentonville Prison, resided sometime in the colony. He described the prisoner population as sunk in the deepest debasement, the ticket holders in great misery, The reformed prisoners committed to the charge of felons, the better disposed taunted as pets, psalm singers, and penitent villains. Whatever had been most strongly affirmed by the enemies of the system was amply sustained by his testimony. To the same effect was the evidence of Mr. Boyd, formerly of Pentonville, and appointed an assistant superintendent to Darlington, Maria Island. This station was regarded by the government as superior to all. Separated entirely from the free population, it was accessible only by authority. Yet close to headquarters, it had the advantage of direct inspection and control. There were, at this time, 800 persons subject to 21 officers, civil and religious. Not a single soldier was on the island, and yet there were no prisoners more orderly or better behaved in Van Diemen's Land. This reputation it maintained, while the stations of Rocky Hills and Broad Marsh were infamous for the abandonment of all order and decency. Few could be favourably compared with Darlington, and none possessed its local advantages. But the interior, as described by Mr. Boyd, entirely changes the scene. He declared the precautions against corrupt intercourse insufficient and unsuccessful. The most disgusting language was common. Hoary villains and boys were worked together. The school books were torn and defaced. Education was mere pretence. A large proportion of offences were unpunished. Lashes were received in hardened indifference. The criminal habits of the men were unbroken. Conspiracies to murder were frequently denounced. On the whole, he concluded that there could exist no better school of crime than a probation station. The laxity which prevailed was everywhere confessed, except by the immediate dependence of government. The Rev. Mr. Fry, a clergyman of Hobart Town, differed, however, with the colony in general. His earnest defence of the probation system in 1845 was published by command and quoted by Lord Stanley in the House of Lords. He asserted that the convict population had placed the settlers in ease and opulence, and that the bulk of the colonists were emancipists who were bound to assist the condemned outcasts of Europe to acquire honesty and independence. The clank of chains, said the reverend gentleman, is now seldom heard, and the deportment of free labourers, grateful and respectful, has succeeded to the scowl of malignity with which the assigned white slaves regarded their owners. He asserted that the gangs recalled the men from intemperance, that they were attentive to religious teaching, that the parties, although almost abandoned to self-discipline, yet lived tranquilly, unawed by surrounding force. These opinions were afterwards modified. Notwithstanding the habitual acquiescence of the colonists in the measures of the Crown, the development of Lord Stanley's system occasioned considerable sensation. The rapid increase of prisoners early excited alarm. The masses accumulated from all parts of the empire presented a new and fearful aspect. Crimes reached a height beyond example in any civilized country. The settlers, environed by parties, were subject to frequent eruptions and were compelled to guard their dwellings as if exposed to a foreign enemy. The men wandered miles from the stations alone. At the hiring depots, they were left almost to their discretion. According to the evidence of a magistrate, neither the Comptroller General nor any confidential subordinate visited the station of Cleveland from its establishment to its dissolution. At another, 90 men near the township of Oatlands, under the charge of one free overseer, were worked in a line of 7 miles extent. A settler, whose flocks had been pillaged, brought back twice in 1 month the same party, and again they escaped, threatening vengeance on the authors of their arrest. At Jerusalem Station, 800 convicts were permitted to roam on their parole, to carry bundles in and out of barracks unsearched, to disguise their persons, and to change their dress. Their daring highway robberies ended in the proof of these facts before the Supreme Court at Hobart Town. At Deloraine, nearly 1,000 prisoners were in charge of 20 persons, including the military. On one occasion, 18 started for the bush and filled the neighbourhood with terror. The local authorities could offer nothing but condolence, and even this poor relief was presented in a peculiar form. It was alleged that the amount of depredation and violence had not risen more rapidly than the number of convicts. This was scarcely correct, but it was little consolatory to the sufferers, assailed so much the more frequently, though by different hands. Their honours the judges, with repeated and pointed condemnation, reprehended the utter want of proper surveillance and restraint, as cruel alike to the settlers and the convicts. nor were the towns exempt from extraordinary inundations. Many hundreds of men were turned out from the penitentiary on Saturday afternoon and were thus exposed to the temptations of a populous city. The officers of the department were charged with the trial of a system professing to breathe the most exalted charity. Had they, however, designed to expose theoretical benevolence to endless execration, no course could have been chosen more obvious. The liberty and indulgence given to the unfortunate prisoners seemed to bring them purposely within the circle of their old temptations. Many were led into scenes which act with fascinating power on men of criminal tendencies. They were often seen lingering for hours around the doors of houses for the sale of liquor. Amusements, which are always attended with some peril, were rendered more public and accessible. Dancing houses of the lowest kind were licensed, until their noise and confusion compelled their suppression. The regulation of night passes became much less practically stringent. Everything facilitated the allurements and the commerce of crime. Receivers were always at hand, and robbers were tolerably insured when the first danger was over, by the rapid shipment of their spoil. Offenders, practiced in the fraud of cities, were admitted into the towns and placed in situations precisely calculated to recall their former habits and excite their habitual passions. The puisne judge, in passing sentence on prisoners of this class for new crimes and holding up their police character in his hands, exclaimed, "Now, Mr. Attorney General, I ask you what we may expect if such men as these are assigned in towns. Is it not surprising that I have to try such cases? It is shameful, it is shameful. And such will be the opinion of mankind. The chief expedients of Lord Stanley to relieve the colony from the redundancy of labour and pressure on the Treasury were never applied. At the suggestion of Mr. Bishton, a clergyman of Westbury, Sir Eardley Wilmot recommended the leasing portions of land to well-conducted ticket holders. This was, however, strongly opposed on the spot, as tending to depreciate property and inconsistent with the social circumstances of the country. The English allotment system was inapplicable. At home, it is a subsidiary to the general resources of the labourer, who can commonly find employment with the farmers and easily dispose of the produce of his supplementary toil. But a project of greater moment was contemplated by Lord Stanley and adopted by Mr. Gladstone and advanced far towards completion. This was the formation of a new colony, called North Australia. The civil list, composed of officers of modest designations, as superintendent, chairman of sessions, and clerk of the peace, was framed with the strictest economy, and the expense was to be defrayed by the English Treasury. The colonists, for the most part, were to consist of exiles landed with pardons, either from England or Van Diemen's Land, and thither female prisoners were intended to be sent. During the first 3 years only, new settlers were to be furnished with food for 1 year, with clothing, tents, tools, bedding, and seed. £10,000 in all were to be expended in public buildings. To the office of superintendent, Colonel Barney was appointed, under the Governor of New South Wales. A party set out for their destination. They were discouraged by the appearance of the country, but before an experiment could be made, they were recalled. A more practical measure was the extension of conditional pardons to the neighbouring countries, the operation of which had been limited to Van Diemen's Land. The dearth of labour in New Holland induced the settlers to send vessels to this colony, and many hundreds, liberated by the new form of pardon, were conveyed to pastoral districts on the opposite shore. During the short official relation of Mr. Secretary Gladstone, who in 1846 succeeded Lord Stanley, Sir Eardley Wilmot was recalled, and Mr. La Trobe and Sir William Denison were placed in succession at the head of our colonial affairs. Like his predecessor, Mr. Gladstone complained that the information conveyed by Wilmot and the Comptroller General, amidst abundant statistics, left the main moral questions obscure. Mr. Forster had passed beyond the reach of censure, and Sir Eardley Wilmot maintained that the actual evils imputed had formed the topic of incessant communications. He derived his impressions from others, and seeing but the surface, was persuaded to the last that the probation system had not failed. The dispatch of Mr. La Trobe fully corroborated the common report. His honest discrimination was worthy his high reputation for integrity. Nothing the reader has perused will be unsustained by his more elaborate analysis, which may be expressed in one sentence as illustrating both the high-wrought theory and the mischievous practice of the probation department. In spite of all the superior arrangements of the system, vice of every description is to be met with on every hand, not as an isolated spot, but as a pervading stain. Dr. Hampton, whose representations had largely contributed to these official changes, which were however fortified by a mass of concurrent testimony, received the appointment of Comptroller General. Meanwhile, the office of Secretary of State for the Colonies devolved on Earl Grey, and at his assumption of office he abandoned at once all the schemes of his predecessors. The practice of transportation he resolved to discontinue, and in its stead to inflict punishment at home, and to send out the prisoners, when entitled to liberation, to the various colonies of the British Empire. His expectation that their labour would be highly prized was fortified by the associations at Port Phillip to obtain labourers from Van Diemen's Land, and the resolutions of the Committee of the New South Wales Council, where a strong disposition was exhibited, on the part of employers, to renew transportation. Several shiploads had been sent from Pentonville, and the nominal lists of their employment and wages appeared to assure an unbounded field for their successors. To shut out the possibility of complaint, however, Earl Grey sent circulars to all the colonies on this side the Cape of Good Hope. The reply was universally adverse, and this plan, which a few years before would have been gladly accepted, was rendered impracticable perhaps forever. The total abandonment of North Australia was a subject of deep regret to its projectors, and was too hastily done. But as a substitute, Earl Grey proposed the creation of villages in the more remote districts of Van Diemen's Land. The erection of houses and a limited cultivation of forest land was expected by his lordship to afford employment for the ticket holders, and to yield a fund for an equal amount of free emigration. It was intended these dwellings, built on quarter-acre allotments, should be sold to prisoners, or subject to a rental of £5 per annum, and a clergyman and schoolmaster provided in each. It would be useless even to examine the plan, which was based on a valuation of Crown lands at that time entirely erroneous, and a fallacious estimate of mere labour in any form whatever. Late changes effected by a more intelligent superintendence and the vigilant censorship of the public may be readily confessed. The decrease of numbers in the gangs and the greatly improved resources of the convict department have ameliorated several evils which formerly elicited great complaint. The male establishments at Hobart Town are patterns of neatness, the female of disorder. It merely remains to be stated that the present system is to send out prisoners when entitled to tickets of leave, to disperse them through various districts in search of labour. In the colony, they enjoy all the privileges of free labourers, except responsibility to a police magistrate. They will be entitled to release at a term prefixed, but on condition that they pay a sum for their passage. Few have either the ability or self-restraint required by this regulation, and unless it is relaxed, they must remain prisoners during the term of their sentence, often for life. A great variety of details might be added, but the total revolution in the system will now lead the inquirer into the state of society rather than the management of gangs and penitentiaries. The dispatches, which fill volumes of blue books, are rather transactions of penal philosophers than trustworthy guides to the historian of transportation, and the writer has not relied exclusively on these authorities, even when he has quoted them, a discretion amply justified by their endless contradictions. Footnotes: it is but just for me to observe that the state of various convict establishments, inquiring into the conduct of the various officers engaged, was not so generally unfavourable as I had been led to anticipate. The negligence and irregularity of subordinate officers cannot be denied. La Trobe's Dispatch, November 1847. Under all the circumstances of the case, therefore, I cannot find language sufficiently strong to express my opinion that convicts considered deserving of any indulgence whatever ought not to be sent to Van Diemen's Land, for in my opinion it would be more just and humane to shut up Pentonville prison at once than to pass men through such a course of training, only to discover, on arriving here, that their previous expectations are a mockery, their present prospects worse than slavery, and their future moral ruin and contamination nearly a certainty. April 1845. The writer thus records his opinion in 1850. If transportation were discontinued, and the colonists, under a free government, were allowed to exercise their own intelligence and develop the resources of their country, the stain and evils of having been the receptacle of criminals would gradually and speedily disappear. For nearly 10 years have the colonists been struggling to relieve themselves from the annual importation of criminals, and throughout that long period they have displayed a spirit and disposition worthy of the highest admiration. Regardless of the profits of convict labor and of the immense government expenditure, they preferred any sacrifice to the continuance of what they considered demoralizing their community. In future ages, their conduct will be regarded as one of the few examples of a people struggling against temporal advantages for morality and virtue. And if the desire of removing a grievous injury and aiding the sufferers in recovering from its effects be a noble feeling, the people of England are bound to afford their powerful sympathy and assistance to the inhabitants of Van Diemen's Land. A system of penal discipline, with a report on the treatment of prisoners in Great Britain and Van Diemen's Land, by the Reverend H.P. Fry. A settler in the interior loses a quantity of sheep. Whether correctly or not, he believes that they are stolen by probationers. Perhaps they are sold, perhaps they are slaughtered, and the wool planted. He finds 2 members of the gang wandering over his grounds. He suspects, challenges them, and on their refusal to withdraw, attempts to arrest them. One of them seizes him by the throat and threatens his life. The timely appearance of his brother enables him to secure them both. He conveys them to the station, lays before the magistrate a charge, who sentences them. They are turned out among the gang without special permanent restraint and abscond again. Our readers may fancy this to be mere romance, but every word of it is truth, and the detailed account will be found in another column. The place is Oatlands. The complainant, Mr. Wilson. The time, last week. Let us look at this case. A settler who bought his land from the government finds in his neighborhood 90 convicts, in the charge of a single overseer. His property, and it is impossible it should be otherwise, is subjected to daily depredation. And who is the real robber? Who, at least, are the more accountable parties? The men whose known propensities have occasioned their transportation. The unfortunate overseer whose life hangs upon his connivance or indifference. Or the government, which, knowing all these circumstances, exposed the men to temptation and the settler to ruin. And what will be the result of all this? The unfortunate settler will chafe, murmur and implore, but he must, at last, gather together the remnant of his property and escape for his life. Observer March, 1846. In another column will be found the proceedings of the criminal court. The puissant judge, in passing sentence on the prisoners, said, "It must be remembered that there are from 20,000 to 30,000 men spread throughout the country, whose increasing offences require that some signal examples should be made. I am sorry to say that crime has increased amongst this class very considerably within the last 2 or 3 years." After dwelling upon the absolute necessity that the executive should rigidly carry out the sentences of the court, he added, "I am sorry to say that within the last 2 or 3 sessions, some 20 or 30 cases of this description, cutting and wounding, have been tried in this court, as great a number as were formerly tried in 2 or 3 years, and also of a more aggravated character." Ibid. The evidence of Mr. James Arnold Wheeler, the superintendent of the St. Mary's Pass Station, exposed some of the beauties of the system. A hawker was robbed within about a mile of the station under very aggravated circumstances, by men in the dress of probationers. It was, of course, important to ascertain who was absent from the station at that particular period, and Mr. Wheeler stated that he could not tell, as all the 3rd class had liberty to roam about within hearing of the bell, about half a mile in any direction from the establishment. When asked by the judge what prevented the men from going further if they pleased, he replied, "Nothing, provided they returned at a certain hour." His Honour shook his head in silence. Examiner, 1846. During the trial of John Burdett in the Supreme Court on the 2nd instant for robbery, the prosecutor, an old man between 60 and 70, swore that he had been robbed, his property taken, 7 times since last Christmas, that his bed, rug and blanket had been taken from his hut, that he lived a mile and a half from Oyster Cove Probation Station, that he was reduced to such straits that he now depends on his neighbours for a little bread to eat, that the superintendent's lady had given him a rug and a blanket, but he had nothing but straw to sleep upon. There is only an open 4-rail fence outside the station to confine the prisoners after they are let out of their sleeping cells. Mr. Justice Montague commented with indignation upon the total want of restraint upon the probationers, and of protection to the poor settlers in the neighbourhood of the station, and expressed in feeling terms his sympathy for the prosecutor's distress and losses, and kindly declared that, if the old man would prepare a petition and forward it to him, he would take care that the clerk of the court should give the jurors an opportunity to join in it, and would use his best endeavours with His Excellency the Lieutenant Governor, who, he was sure, would feel happiness in extending compensation if it were in his power. In passing sentence of transportation for 15 years, the lightest which the law permits in cases of robbery, His Honour protested that, considering the position of the prisoner, placed in a probation station, but having no restraint laid upon him to prevent from going in quest of luxuries and comforts, he would be fair to pass a lighter sentence. He felt the inefficiency of the sentence that he was about to pronounce, but he had no alternative. Accordingly, he passed the mitigated sentence of 15 years' transportation. Courier, September 1846. End of chapter 75, being transportation. Section 24.